I'm not refusing to identify with being masculine or feminine in any particular like way, but I'm just like that.
Like people pretending that we're not here is very hard. So there's something that one of my professors gave me that's like a sheet with definitions, and that's sort of what like spurred on this project, because I was like, I don't agree with most of these definitions, but these are written like by a queer person who is like like an academic queer person who is like defining the world as they see it. And but like I don't really define myself in that way for like a lot of these, and so I really wanted to like see just have a conversation, like ideally with people who sort of have different perspectives, instead of people being like, yeah, like trans rights, whatever, people getting into the like sorry, I'm not anti-trans rights. Just to be clear. I didn't take it that way. I just found it very funny how you're like interjection with that.
Yeah, but like, no, I don't actually support trans. I don't actually believe in trans people. No, but I just, instead of like everybody sort of agreeing on stuff, I really wanted to get into the like, where do we disagree? Like, where do we find different perspectives and can still celebrate those? Okay, so let me read this definition from, I just have that the source is Miller 2019. I'll put on the screen like the full source if you want to go check it out. So this says, gender non-binary is an imaginative and expressive matrix of ideas about gender, and non-binary gender identity is expression of gender identity that can refuse, align with, or play with representations of gender that can shift. Relatedly, okay. Just to throw this last one in, agender, and interestingly, A is in parentheses here. Ah, very nice. Okay.
So agender refers to the rejection of gender as a biological or social construct altogether, and the refusal to identify with gender. And these are written by an agender person.
That's interesting. Because I don't agree with either of those for me personally. Yeah, like I don't know, when you were saying the definitions for like non-binary and non-binary gender identity, I thought they sounded a little bit like they were kind of infantilizing the identity a little bit. Like, I don't know, maybe that's just me reading too much into it, but I didn't really like I just, in general, this is a me thing, I don't really enjoy it when people use terms like plays with when it comes to like gender identity, because to me, like my personal experience is it's a very like, it's something I've grappled with a lot, and I play with my gender expression, like how I dress and like how I present, but I don't play with my identity.
I was about to say, like, I mean, I don't like the word playing with either, but I also just like in the past have experienced gender as kind of like, it does kind of switch back and forth and go in between. It is a spectrum, especially when it comes to just like how I identify day to day. And so it's just kind of strange to be like, I don't know, it was like certain ways that they put it into words of just like between like masculine, feminine, yada, yada, yada. It's like, I don't really see my gender is necessarily masculine or feminine in certain days. It's just kind of there. And then like my gender expression is kind of more masculine or feminine, depending on how I feel day to day.
With their definition of agender as well, it was less like gross to me and more just kind of funny how they defined it as like a refusal and a rejection, and it kind of brought me back to your question about like political identity versus gender identity.
What prompted this question.
Yeah, that felt very political, so I don't like that definition either, because it sounds very political first and foremost, when I'm not refusing to identify with being masculine or feminine in any particular like way, but I'm just like that. Yeah.
I'm not like, I've tried incredibly hard to conform to one side or the other, and it has not worked. It has made me very sad. So it's like, it's not like a rebellion. It's just me like living.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I thought that was a very interesting way of talking about it.
No, it makes a lot of sense. This says gender expression is a physical manifestation of one's gender identity through behavior, clothing, hairstyle, voice, body shape, etc., which may or may not conform to socially defined behaviors and characteristics. I kind of agree with that, for me at least.
Yeah, I also agree with that. Because I think the term gender expression is something that can be defined, but I think with like defining what identities are, especially gender identities, that's incredibly like personal, and I think it's going to change a lot from person to person. So it's really hard to give like an exact like specific definition for things like non-binary and agender that are like umbrella terms for the most part.
That makes so
especially
much sense.
Yeah, and especially when they use so much like intense and like, especially when they use so much intense language, like reject or things like that. It's just that's a very quite obviously, to me, that person was speaking from very personal experience. Like that was a reflection of their experience with their gender identity, but it's not necessarily an expression, or it's not necessarily a good portrayal of how other people experience that identity, which is interesting.
Yeah, I agree to that. I agree with that, definitely. I think that it like expression is like totally like, oh, you're just like expressing yourself through clothes, makeup, etc., hair. And identity, it's very dependent on like your personal background, like what you've experienced in the world, how you experienced your gender, kind of people's reaction to that as well, I think, to some extent, just because like some people like will be more accepting than other people, obviously, and kind of, especially with like other trans people, it's more like, oh, okay, like I understand that like in general you fall under like the trans umbrella, and so you can kind of talk to them and be like, okay, we fall under the same umbrella, even though we like experience different ways. Versus with cis people, it's kind of just like they don't necessarily understand it, and they can like ask you questions, but like oftentimes they're very invasive and not very fun.
So all three of us have sort of said like, oh, we don't agree with all of these definitions, even though these are like definitions written by a queer person reflecting their own identity. I actually don't know if this person uses the word queer to describe themselves, but I believe they use the word agender and the word non-binary to describe themselves. So if someone I know comes to me and, you know, says like, oh, you know, I'm queer, these are words that I use to describe myself, I'm in the LGBTQ plus community, and this is how I identify, and, you know, maybe I'm a parent or a teacher or something like that, I don't necessarily want to just keep asking that kid like, oh, okay, can you explain what that means? Can you define that for me? That kind of thing, because that can be challenging for the student or child or adult or whatever situation it is to sort of have to like explain their whole gender identity or sexuality or, you know, identity in general to an adult or a kid, you know, like to anybody. And so I think that lists of definitions like this can be really helpful in terms of allowing people to just go on the internet, go to JSTOR, go wherever, and find out more about different definitions. So we were talking earlier about how it's important to let people self-identify. And I'm curious how you would respond to, you know, let's say parents or teachers wanting to say, I don't want to just like ask, especially let's say teachers, because parents like do have a closer relationship with their kid in many situations. You know, if you're a teacher with a student, you don't necessarily want to just start like asking about their identity and asking questions that the kid might find invasive. So how do you go and learn more about that if it's all about individual definitions? I'm not saying there's a right answer. I just want to bring it up.
That's a really hard one. I mean, I'd say to some extent, like kind of, I mean, without being invasive, just kind of being like, okay, cool. Like, let me know if there's something that I can do. Obviously, like, how can I support you in like this identity? And then as well, just being like, kind of asking them like, hey, like, are there good resources for me to kind of learn more generally about the identities that you like align yourself with? And I mean, obviously, like, you can do that on your own time from like JSTOR and stuff, like you said, but I don't know,
Or
it's
like
very
Flag
hard.
and other,
Exactly.
you know, other LGBTQ, the Trevor Project, even like other LGBTQ
Exactly.
organizations.
And I think that it's just hard because those will mostly give kind of wide umbrella definitions, and since it's so individualized, I think that it would be really difficult for it to be like, for you to kind of try and figure out more about their identity without necessarily being super invasive about it. I'm trying to think how you would do that. I'm trying to think now.
I think I think the best way to go about like asking people about certain identities without being invasive would be to be like, hey, I'm really interested in this identity or this topic. If you ever feel like talking about it to me, please do, but I am not pressuring you to. Because,
and then just leaving the topic, and not like not trying,
and then just being like
asking.
Yeah, and then that person should Google things in the meantime. But I think that if someone came up to me and was like, hey, I'm really curious about this identity, could you explain more about it, like when you feel like it, if you feel like it, I'd be like, yeah, okay, and then I'd like talk about it. I don't know. I think just leaving things open for the person you're asking, just like in any situation, is best. Like not forcing them into a corner, like you have to talk about this right now. I think that's the best way to be respectful about it.
Yeah, I also think like we were talking about how definitions don't always like line up with the way somebody defines a word for themselves. But I think that often what like going on the internet and, you know, whether that's reading like very academic things, or just like watching YouTube videos of 12-year-olds talking like to the camera about, you know, what they think and that kind of thing. I think that those all allow for just a certain level of familiarity with common terms and common ways to define something, and like how a lot of people think about this one thing, and then you may be more aware of issues that come up. So like if sometimes I find it challenging when, especially like in high school or middle school, a teacher would expect me to know everything about the LGBTQ plus community and be the resource for everything. And I did really, really like answering questions, and I really liked to self-advocate and advocate for other trans folks that, you know, would be in the future in my school and were in my school at the time. But at the same time, sometimes it was hard when somebody really had very limited familiarity, maybe like had a cousin that was gay or a niece or nephew that was gay or something like that, and just sort of had like just very limited exposure to the LGBTQ plus community. Whereas if somebody, you know, had like watched some YouTube videos or like read articles or done, just exposed themselves a little bit to, you know, LGBTQ plus and specifically trans and non-binary communities, then they might better know some of the questions to ask. If a teacher had said to me like, hey, we're about to go on a field trip, I'm not sure if there's going to be gender neutral bathrooms, is that something that would be helpful for you to for me to call ahead or try to find somewhere that has a, family bathroom or something like that, that would have been so incredible. But just having some amount of familiarity with like just LGBTQ plus issues and trans issues allows you to sort of know like maybe you want to ask the student, like if a student has just come out to you, maybe you want to say like, oh, like, okay, and can you tell me your pronouns? Or like, oh, okay. And if a student says like, I kind of want to use the name Ash, but I'm not sure, then saying like, okay, would you like me to call you Ash in class? Would you like me to call you Ash in front of your parents? That kind of thing. And just knowing some of those questions, I think, can be really helpful.
I agree with pretty much everything you said. So I went to 2 high schools, one in the deep South and one in a northern college town. So, kind of massive difference. If you're following stereotypes, and they did follow stereotypes as far as northern versus southern stuff goes. I think that, so even though like my second high school, the one in the north, was a lot more like into accepting like queer kids, they were kind of like in the like, oh, we accept queer kids,
so we don't need to do anything.
That's all we're gonna
do.
Yeah. So like we didn't have gender neutral bathrooms on like in our high school. We had this one English teacher who was like the kind of classic cishet, but I'm really woke and I know things, kind of woman. She did a lot of pretty terrible things right before I graduated, and that was like, that made me very, very distrustful of cis people for a while.
What do you mean by that?
So for Pride Month, she decided to take a list of definitions of identities in the LGBT plus community and teach them to her class, which was in theory a very good idea. And in practice, it was terrible and awful because she ended up picking something on the internet that was like 95% inaccurate. And like we were talking about how like definitions for identities are fluid and they vary from person to person. These ones were just all incorrect. They weren't even in the ballpark of like where they were supposed to be. And also they defined certain slurs that she proceeded to say out loud while she was teaching. And it led to a couple of queer kids having to out themselves to her in order to tell her, hey, this isn't okay. You need to stop. Like, you need to not do that again, basically. And that's another example of why I think, especially if you're cishet, if you're not a part of the community, you need to like kind of take your own steps to familiarize yourself with things before you try and kind of shove your way into them like she did. I wasn't in that class, but I heard about it secondhand. There are several pictures of me talking to my friends about it. In all of them, I am just like visibly furious in attack dog mode. It was terrible. It was the worst. But yeah, and then after that, I was just like, I am not going to talk to any cis people about my identity now for like a year. I just can't, I don't have the energy. So it is so much better to ask respectfully before you do something like that, and familiarize yourself with things before you do something like that than it is to make the mistake, because it harms very, very much. And so that's just kind of what that reminded me of.
Yeah. I think you're not saying that teachers who don't have much experience with queer topics should be teaching, about the LGBTQ plus community, but rather that they should try to do some research before they do, right?
Yes, definitely. Because I think it's really important to teach about these things. Like if I had been taught about these things when I was younger, it would have saved me a lot of grief later on, like trying to figure myself out, I think. But I mean, that English teacher was an example of doing it in like the worst way possible. And then later on, she excused it. I am quoting her verbatim. I have a gay brother. She was like, I have a gay brother, so I'm equipped to speak on this. and I didn't need to do the extra research. So, you know, that is textbook example of what not to do if you are a teacher and you are handed the opportunity to talk with queer students about queer topics. I definitely think teachers should not be afraid of teaching these things. I think the only thing that really like stands out to me that I really want to talk about is misconceptions about non-binary people, and it's going to be a little bit ironic considering considering both Eva and myself, but I think that a big misconception about non-binary people is that it's all just like white AFAB assigned female at birth people, and that's it. And so like that's a really harmful stereotype, and I really don't like that it's developing that way, because particularly that everyone who is non-binary is AFAB, because it means that people begin to see non-binary people as just women but in a different flavor. Which is not what that is. Like I had my grandfather, who simply is just so disconnected from all like this whole topic because he just hasn't ever thought to look into it. And I am not out to him, so he said this to me, you know, thinking this is my female granddaughter. He was like, oh, I went and I attended this online lecture, and what was interesting was a lot of people had the pronouns that they go by as like part of their name, and I noticed that quite a few of the female participants were going by they them, and I was like, oh,
So close yet so far.
and it hurt me a little bit. And I was like, he does not mean anything bad by this at all. This poor man is just confused. But that stereotype is really harmful, because it hurts both people who are assigned male at birth that identify as non-binary. It means that people take them less seriously, and it harms non-binary people who are female assigned at birth or assigned female at birth, because also it means people take them less seriously. They are viewed as just women in a different flavor, like I said, and that has personally like affected me at times, like with my grandfather and with other relatives bringing things like that up, and you know, people outside of my family bringing things like that up. And then I think the same thing also applies to non-white non-binary people. If the image of non-binary people is just white people, if there is like, say, a Black person who identifies as non-binary, people are going to be like, no, that's a white thing. And that is not the case, and that is very harmful, and it's gross. And so I think, you know, in summary, non-binary people, what I would like people to know about the non-binary identity is it is such a wide and diverse range of people. There are so many non-binary people with so many different backgrounds, of so many like different races and other identities, and it's really incredible. It is great and fantastic, and more people need to acknowledge that.
Yeah. I'm going to kind of use that as a segue into the people respecting your pronouns piece, because personally for me, as somebody who wasn't out to my parents until fairly recently, it was really hard, especially when I was home, like over break and stuff, to like be surrounded by all of these queer and trans people at school and being gendered correctly by them and being gendered correctly by my teammates and my classmates and my professors, etc. And then to go home and like the people who have known me the longest to misgender me was really hard. And I think that also the kind of, I don't know, there's kind of a little bit of a difficulty there also with being a student athlete, because it's like the men's team versus the women's team. And since I'm not a woman, I'm not a man, I'm just sitting there, I'm like, I guess I have to race in the women's race because I am AFAB, but also just like, there are a lot of times when there's like stuff that happens on like within the team that's like oh yeah, there's like a ladies' night, like party with the girls' team. It's like, okay, I'll go to that because I'm part of that team, but like that's not how I identify. And like all the people will always be cheering for us and they'll be like, go women. And it's like, I'm not a woman. So like I find that part very difficult and hard because like I know that it's just kind of an umbrella term, but it also like is very difficult for myself and just being like, I don't identify that way. Like I don't like it when people like refer to me in an identity that I don't identify with, and just kind of I don't know. That's basically what my thought is.
Yeah, definitely big, strong agree on that. When I like, the thing that pushed me to come out to my parents was, which I did over our last break. So it's very recent, like only a few weeks ago. The thing that pushed me to come out to my parents, it was having to go home every break after being gendered correctly and referred to with they them pronouns for, you know, months at a time, and then going home and being like, oh, there she is, there's like our daughter, our girl daughter who is here being a girl. And I was like, it was making me actively incredibly depressed. And I explained that to them when I came out. I was like, part of the reason I've been able to wear like feminine clothing or like just things like that is because people have been respecting the pronouns that I go by. And that's one of the reasons I'm uncomfortable wearing feminine clothing at home, because people don't respect the pronouns that I go by. And that wasn't their fault because they didn't know. But it's like explaining that to them kind of put into perspective for me how important just the pronouns and like correct names are. Like even just that has made me so much more comfortable doing like everything else.
Yeah.
So I think it is like the most important thing.
Yeah.
If you do nothing else, you should respect people's pronouns, because that's like that's the bottom line.
Yeah, bottom, like bare minimum, but also like it's kind of hard because like you were saying, like there are like you've been here, there are people gendering you correctly. It's like it feels really good. But then also I find it sometimes that like people on the team will slip up even though they've known me since like over the summer, because that's when we started to like reach out to each other and be like, hey, like let's go on Zoom calls and like get to know each other, etc. And like that was like one of the first things that I like put in my like intro emails, like these are my pronouns, because like I knew that as soon as I was at Vassar, I wanted to be like everybody to know that. And so when people kind of slip up, or when people just like have simply not used my correct pronouns, it's really frustrating, like Alex said, and just kind of it really affects how I view myself and how kind of it forces me to be like, I like dressing in a feminine way, and this is like how I defined it to my friends when I came out. It's like I like being feminine, I like presenting in a feminine way, but I don't like being perceived as female. So it's a really hard place to be in.
Definitely. Once again, yes to all of that. Yeah, no, I think probably the most hurt I have ever been as a non-binary person is when people who have only known me by the pronouns I go by slip up. I'm like, oh, it is just soul crushing. It is terrible. And like mistakes happen, whatever, but it hurts quite a bit. And that like kind of puts into perspective how important that is.
When people watch this conversation, what do you hope they remember?
That we're here, we're not really going away, even if you try and define us out of existence, like a lot of places are trying to do. Ask questions to your friends who have different identities, not invasive questions though. Be kind, and like we already explained. Do your own research if need be. Go to reputable sources so you don't have a situation like the English teacher at Alex's high school, and just kind of accept people as they are. Don't try and convince them to think one way or another, I guess is the way I would put it.
Yeah, I think, yeah, I really hope people remember all of those things as well. I also just hope that they remember that like everybody knows best how they identify, and trying to convince people that they are wrong is never the way to go. And chances are, if you are cisgender and heterosexual, you know someone who is not, and you should want to be at your most respectful of them, because that is what they deserve. Yeah, just like, and honestly, even if you happen to not somehow like not know anybody who is queer in any way, you should want to be respectful to queer people because they are just people. Like there's nothing different. It's just different pronouns. It's just different love, I guess. It shouldn't be as massive of an issue as, you know, people have made it.
That all makes sense. Thank you guys so much. Yay, good job.
Yay.